September 1st, 1939. The guns opened before dawn. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein had been moored in Danzig harbor for 3 days, officially on a courtesy visit. Nobody was fooled. The Polish garrison at the Westerplatte military depot, across the water, had been watching it. They had been watching a lot of things: the newspapers, the radio, the movements of German troops along the border, the particular quality of tension that settles over a place when war is not a question of whether, but of when. At 4:45 in the morning, the Schleswig-Holstein's guns opened fire on the Westerplatte. 182 Polish soldiers were inside. They were supposed to hold the position for 12 hours. They held it for 7 days. That is where World War II begins. Not with a declaration of war, not with a diplomatic failure or a meeting in a room where important men signed important papers. It begins with guns firing before sunrise on a September morning, and with a small garrison of soldiers deciding to hold their position against a battleship and everything that came after it. But to understand why those guns opened, you have to go back further, much further, to a world still bleeding from one war and moving, without quite understanding it was moving, into the next. The world in 1919 was exhausted. The First World War had killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people, wounded twice as many, destroyed the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires in 4 years of industrialized slaughter so profound that the generation which survived it could not fully speak about what they had seen. They called it the Great War. They called it the war to end all wars. They built monuments and held silences and tried in various ways to make meaning from something that resisted meaning. The peace that followed was fragile from the first moment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors at the palace from which French kings had once commanded Europe, imposed on Germany a set of conditions that the German delegation signed under protest and that the German public received as a national humiliation. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which assigned to Germany the legal responsibility for causing the war, was the most resented. Germany was required to pay reparations, to surrender territory, to disarm. The German military was restricted to 100,000 men. The fleet was surrendered. The colonies were taken. This was not peace. This was a pause. The economic consequences of the treaty, combined with the global economic catastrophe of the Great Depression that began in 1929, created in Germany the specific conditions of mass desperation that made extremist politics not just possible, but attractive. By 1932, a quarter of the German workforce was unemployed. Banks were failing. Savings were worthless. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s had already destroyed the savings of the middle class once, and now the Depression was finishing the job. People who had built lives according to the rules of a stable world found those rules no longer applying. Into that desperation came a voice that offered an explanation and a target. Adolf Hitler had been born in Austria in 1889, the son of a customs official. He had failed as an artist in Vienna, drifted into the Munich underworld, served as a dispatch runner in the First World War, and emerged from it with the conviction that Germany had been betrayed from within, stabbed in the back, as the mythology had it, by Jews and communists and the weak men who had signed the armistice. This conviction, absurd on its face and contradicted by every piece of available evidence, nevertheless provided a simple and emotionally satisfying explanation for a catastrophic military defeat that the German public had not seen coming because the military had not told them how badly the war was going. He joined the German Workers' Party, a tiny political organization in Munich. He began to speak, and when Hitler spoke, people listened in a way they had not listened to other politicians, because his words connected to the rage and the humiliation and the fear of a population that had been told its suffering was its own fault. And he told them it was someone else's fault. And the relief of that, the permission to direct the suffering outward rather than inward, was intoxicating to people who had been suffering for a decade. He became the leader of the party, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, attempted a coup in Munich in 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, a farcical failure in which Hitler and his followers marched through the streets of Munich and were dispersed by police gunfire, with Hitler diving to the ground and dislocating his shoulder. was imprisoned for 9 months in the comfortable Landsberg prison, used the imprisonment to dictate a book called Mein Kampf to his deputy Rudolf Hess, in which he laid out his ideology with complete clarity and no ambiguity whatsoever, and emerged from prison to rebuild the party through legitimate political means. Mein Kampf said everything. It said that the Jewish people were Germany's primary enemy. It said that the German people required Lebensraum, living space, in the East, to be taken from the Slavic peoples who currently occupied it. It said that Germany's future lay in continental domination, not in the overseas empire that had been taken by the Versailles Treaty. It said that parliamentary democracy was a corruption and a weakness. None of this was subtle. None of it was hidden between the lines. It was explicit. It was published. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. The world read it and largely decided that it was the fantasy of a crank who would never gain real power, or that it was rhetorical exaggeration that would be moderated by the responsibilities of office, or that it was true, but that engaging with it was unnecessary because he would never actually do any of it. They were wrong on every count. By January 1933, the National Socialists were the largest party in the German parliament. Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Hindenburg, who believed that Hitler could be controlled by the conservative establishment that surrounded him. Within months, through the Reichstag fire, which the Nazis used as a pretext to suspend civil liberties, and the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the power to rule by decree, and the elimination of political opposition through the Gestapo and the concentration camps that began operating in 1933, he had made himself dictator of Germany. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened in March 1933. The first inmates were political prisoners, communists, socialists, trade unionists. The racial ideology that would eventually produce the Holocaust was already present from the beginning, but in 1933 it was being expressed through discriminatory legislation rather than mass murder. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship and prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jewish children were expelled from German schools. The escalation was gradual enough to be accepted incrementally by a population that had not expected it and did not want to believe where it was going. Each step seemed shocking and then, after a few months, normalized. And then the next step came. The world watched, and the world, by and large, decided to accommodate. The policy was called appeasement, and its architects were not fools or cowards, though history has treated them as both. They were men who had lived through the First World War, and who believed, with genuine sincerity, that the conditions that had produced the Great War, the entangled alliances, the mobilization schedules, the mutual misunderstandings that had spiraled into catastrophe in 1914, must not be allowed to operate again. They believed that negotiation could work, that Hitler's demands, however aggressive, were ultimately addressable, that each concession would satisfy the appetite and the expansion would stop. They were wrong in the most consequential way possible. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. Nothing happened. He absorbed Austria in 1938 in the Anschluss. Nothing happened. He demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. At Munich in September 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to hand it over. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper, saying the words that history would not forgive him. Peace for our time. 6 months later, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. In August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which secretly divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was in the German sphere. On September 1, 1939, the guns opened before dawn. Poland fell in 5 weeks. The German military had developed a new doctrine of warfare that the world had not seen before. They called it combined arms warfare. Journalists and historians would later call it blitzkrieg, lightning war. The concept was simple and devastating. Armor, infantry, artillery, and air power were not separate services that supported each other. They were a single integrated system that moved faster than the enemy could respond. Panzer divisions broke through the lines and drove deep into the rear before the defenders could organize a counterattack. The Luftwaffe destroyed the enemy air force on the ground and then supported the ground troops with close air support. The infantry mopped up what the tanks had bypassed. Poland's military was not weak. Its soldiers were brave and its officers were capable. But they were fighting a 19th century war against a 20th century army. The cavalry charges that had been effective in earlier conflicts were devastated by tanks and aircraft. The defensive lines that might have held against a conventional attack were bypassed and encircled. Within 2 weeks, German forces had advanced to the outskirts of Warsaw. Within 3 weeks, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The last Polish forces surrendered on October 6th. The speed of it shocked the world. Even the Germans were surprised by how quickly their doctrine had worked. In the West, France and Britain had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 2 days after the invasion of Poland. But for 8 months, almost nothing happened. The French called it the drôle de guerre, the phony war. The British called it the Boer War. Both sides watched each other across the Maginot Line and the German Siegfried Line, neither willing to attack first. There was fighting at sea. The naval war had begun immediately, but on land, nothing. The phony war ended on May 10th, 1940. Germany invaded France and the Low Countries simultaneously. In the north, German forces swept through Belgium and the Netherlands as expected. This was the direction the Allied commanders anticipated the main attack. What they did not anticipate was the thrust through the Ardennes forest in the south. The Ardennes was considered impassable for a major armored force. The terrain was too difficult, the roads too narrow, the forest too dense. French military planners had barely fortified this sector. They were wrong. 45 German divisions, including 7 panzer divisions, moved through the Ardennes in 3 days. They emerged behind the Allied lines on May 13th and drove for the English Channel. By May 21st, German forces had reached the coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and a significant portion of the French army in the north. The Allied forces fell back to Dunkirk. What happened next was one of those moments in history where the difference between catastrophe and something slightly less than catastrophe depended on decisions made in a span of days. Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to halt before Dunkirk, a decision that has been debated ever since, attributed to various factors including Göring's desire to let the Luftwaffe claim the victory, concerns about the boggy terrain near the coast, the need to rest and refit the armored divisions before the final push south into France. Whatever the reason, the pause lasted 3 days. Those 3 days saved the British Army. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, lasted from May 26th to June 4th. The Royal Navy had originally estimated that perhaps 45,000 men could be saved. In the end, 338,000 soldiers were evacuated, not just by naval vessels, the famous armada of little ships, the pleasure boats and fishing vessels and river ferries, commandeered from their civilian owners, also crossed the channel and carried soldiers from the beaches. The men were saved. The equipment was abandoned. The beaches at Dunkirk were littered with trucks and artillery and tanks, and the entire material apparatus of an army that had just been defeated in the most decisive fashion in living memory. The evacuation itself was chaos organized into something that worked. Ships were bombed at the quayside. Men waded out chest deep into the water to reach vessels that could not come closer to shore. The lines stretched across the beaches, men standing waist deep in the sea waiting their turn, the German Luftwaffe attacking in waves, anti-aircraft guns firing back from the beach and from the naval vessels. At night, the bombers could not see so well, and the pace of embarkation increased. The little ships came and went, loaded to the waterline, their civilian captains navigating a channel full of wrecks and mines and the darkness of a wartime crossing without lights. 338,000 men, most of them British, many of them French, exhausted, shaken, without their weapons and equipment, but alive. Churchill addressed the House of Commons. He told them the truth about Dunkirk first, that it was a colossal military disaster, that wars are not won by evacuations. He named what had been lost. He did not pretend. And then he told them what he intended. The words that follow are the most famous he ever spoke, and they deserve to be heard in full, or as close to full as a sleep video allows. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. The House of Commons sat silent for a moment. Then it erupted. Churchill reportedly muttered to a colleague afterward that they would fight with broken bottles because that was all they had. But the speech did what it needed to do. It established, publicly and irrevocably, that Britain was not going to negotiate. France fell on June 22, 1940, 46 days after the German offensive began. The speed of France's collapse stunned the world. France in 1940 was generally considered one of the great military powers of the world. Its army was large, its equipment was not inferior to Germany's, its officers were experienced. But the army's doctrine was defensive, oriented around the Maginot Line strategy, and when the German attack came through a sector the French had not prepared for, the command structure could not adapt quickly enough. Confusion spread. Orders failed to reach their destinations. Units fought bravely in isolation, while the overall situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The armistice divided France. The north and west came under direct German occupation. The south became the Vichy regime, a French government that collaborated with Germany and retained a degree of nominal sovereignty at the price of its soul. The Vichy government, under the aged Marshal Pétain, eventually went beyond collaboration to active participation in the persecution of Jews and the deportation of French citizens to German labor camps. Not all of France accepted Vichy. From London, a relatively unknown French general named Charles de Gaulle broadcast a radio appeal to the French people not to accept defeat. He called on soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had escaped to Britain to continue the fight. He proclaimed that the flame of French resistance must not go out and would not go out. Most French people in France did not hear the broadcast. Those who did mostly had no way to respond to it. But the Free French movement that de Gaulle built from London would eventually grow into a genuine force, and the French resistance, the network of ordinary civilians who chose, at enormous personal risk, to oppose the occupation through intelligence gathering and sabotage and the hiding of Allied airmen and Jewish families, would become one of the most celebrated aspects of the entire war. Britain stood alone. If you are finding peace in this tonight, go ahead and subscribe to Ancient Sleep Stories. More slow history is waiting for you whenever you need it. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate. He had no particular desire to destroy the British Empire, which he regarded as a useful institution whose continued existence served German interests. He expected the British, faced with the complete defeat of their continental allies and the prospect of a German invasion, to accept terms. Churchill would not negotiate. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, was tasked with destroying the Royal Air Force as a precondition for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Göring was confident. The Luftwaffe had been dominant in Poland and France. The British RAF was smaller. The task seemed manageable. It was not manageable. The RAF had several significant advantages that the Luftwaffe's planners had not adequately accounted for. The most important was radar. Britain had developed a chain of radar stations along its southern and eastern coast, the Chain Home Network, that could detect incoming German aircraft over the channel and give the RAF warning time to scramble its fighters. Without radar, the British would have been fighting blind, sending aircraft up in the general direction of an attack, hoping to find the enemy before fuel ran out. With radar, they could concentrate their forces at the point of attack, committing the minimum number of fighters necessary to each engagement and holding the rest in reserve. The second advantage was that they were fighting over home territory. A German pilot shot down over Britain was a prisoner. A British pilot shot down over Britain could, if he survived, be back in his cockpit the next day. This asymmetry and attrition mattered enormously as the battle stretched from weeks into months. The third advantage was production. British aircraft factories, under the driven almost to the point of crisis by Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production, were producing Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the pilots were being lost. The Germans were not replacing their aircraft at the same rate. The pilots themselves, the few, as Churchill would later call them, were extraordinary. Young men, most of them in their early to mid-20s, flying 4 or 5 sorties a day in aircraft that could absorb enormous punishment, landing at sunset, exhausted beyond speech, and sleeping for a few hours and doing it again the next morning. They were British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealander, South African, Rhodesian. They were Polish and Czech, men who had escaped their occupied countries and crossed Europe and the Channel, and were now fighting over England against the same enemy that had taken their homes. There were even Americans, volunteers, unofficially, before the United States entered the war. The Luftwaffe came in waves through the summer of 1940, first attacking shipping in the Channel, then attacking the radar stations and the airfields. The airfield attacks were the most dangerous phase. RAF, Fighter Command, was taking unsustainable losses in August, the pilots exhausted, the aircraft production barely keeping pace with the losses, the maintenance crews working around the clock. Had the Luftwaffe continued to attack the airfields for another few weeks, the RAF might have broken. Then the Germans bombed London. A navigational error by a German crew on the night of August 24th resulted in bombs falling on residential areas of London. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. Hitler, furious, ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks to London and other British cities. This was called the Blitz. It was a strategic error of the first order. The shift from attacking airfields to attacking cities gave the RAF the breathing space it needed to recover. The pilot losses continued, but the trained pilots on the ground, who had been exhausted by weeks of daily combat, had time to rest. The damaged airfields were repaired. The pressure on Fighter Command eased at exactly the moment when it had been closest to breaking. The Blitz itself lasted from September 1940 to May 1941. London was bombed on 57 consecutive nights. People sheltered in the underground stations, sleeping on the platforms and the tunnels while the bombs fell above them. They emerged in the mornings to find streets they knew changed beyond recognition. Gaps where buildings had stood, rubble where neighborhoods had been, the particular smell of burnt timber and plaster dust that survivors describe as the smell of the Blitz. The Londoners, and the people of Coventry and Liverpool and Bristol and Birmingham and all the other cities that were bombed, did not break. This was not what the theory of strategic bombing, which held that bombing civilian populations would destroy civilian morale and force governments to sue for peace, had predicted. What happened instead was something that would be observed again and again when cities were bombed. The survivors became more determined, not less. The shared experience of survival created solidarity. The evidence of German brutality removed any doubt about what the war was about. By mid-September, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had survived. Churchill summed up what had happened with characteristic economy. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The cost had been enormous. 44,000 British civilians killed in the Blitz. Whole neighborhoods of London, Coventry, Bristol, Liverpool, Southampton reduced to rubble. But the RAF was intact. The country was intact. And the war was going to be longer than anyone had imagined in September 1939. In North Africa, the war was being fought in the desert. Italy had entered the war on Germany's side in June 1940, when it was clear that France was falling and Mussolini did not want to be left out of a German victory. Italy controlled Libya, on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, and from Libya, the Italians threatened British Egypt and the Suez Canal, the vital artery connecting Britain to its empire in Asia and the Far East. The Italian offensive into Egypt in September 1940 was tentative and ultimately ineffective. The British counterattacked in December and drove the Italians back hundreds of miles into Libya. It looked like a British victory. And then Hitler sent Rommel. Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941 with 2 German divisions, the Afrika Korps. He attacked before his forces were fully assembled, before the British had anticipated a counterattack, and before anyone in Germany or Britain fully understood what was coming. In 2 months, he had pushed the British back to the Egyptian border. The desert war that followed, the back and forth across the Libyan desert over the next 2 years, became one of the most complex and technically demanding campaigns of the entire war. It was a war of supply lines and fuel and water, of vast distances and fast-moving armored formations, of intelligence and counterintelligence, of commanders who were learning new forms of warfare in real time. Rommel's skill made him a legend on both sides, but he was fighting at the end of a supply line that ran across the Mediterranean under constant British attack, and the British supply line ran through the Suez Canal and was short and secure. In the end, logistics won. They usually do. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in the history of warfare. 3 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces, attacked along a front of nearly 3,000 kilometers. The objective was the destruction of the Soviet Union before the end of 1941, before the Russian winter set in, before the enormous Soviet reserves of manpower could be mobilized and trained and equipped, before the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union could be fully turned to war production. The German generals were confident. The Soviet Red Army had been devastated by Stalin's purges of 1937 to 38, in which the dictator had executed or imprisoned most of its senior and experienced officers. The performance of the Red Army in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 40 had been humiliating. A small Finnish army had held off a Soviet force many times its size for 3 months at enormous Soviet cost. The Wehrmacht had watched and concluded that the Red Army was a hollow force, impressive in numbers but crippled in leadership and doctrine. They underestimated the enemy, and they underestimated the country. The initial results were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Stalin had been warned by British intelligence derived from the Enigma decrypts, by German defectors, by his own spy Richard Sorge operating in Tokyo, who had access to German diplomatic communications, that the attack was coming. He had refused to believe it, or had been unable to act on the belief. The psychological and political dynamics of the Stalin regime made it genuinely dangerous to tell the leader things he did not want to hear. Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler would not attack before defeating Britain, and any information that contradicted this conviction was filtered or ignored. When the German attack came on June 22nd, the Red Army was caught unprepared. Frontline units had not been placed on alert. Aircraft were lined up on airfields in neat rows, perfect targets for the Luftwaffe's opening strikes. In the first days of the invasion, Soviet losses were catastrophic. Thousands of aircraft destroyed on the ground, entire divisions encircled and cut off before they understood what was happening. Stalin, according to contemporary accounts, was paralyzed for several days. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and did not communicate with his commanders. The Soviet government functioned without him for the better part of a week. When he recovered his composure, he addressed the Soviet people by radio. He called them comrades, brothers and sisters, my friends, a departure from the formal party language that was noticed by everyone who heard it. He told them the truth about how serious the situation was, and he called on them to fight. The Soviet people fought. In the first 3 months, the Germans took more than 3 million Soviet prisoners. They encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies in the battles of Kiev and Vyazma and Bryansk. The numbers of dead and captured were so large that the German logistical system could not cope with the prisoners. They were left in open fields surrounded by wire, dying of exposure and starvation and disease in numbers that amounted to a deliberate policy of extermination. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The distances were too vast. The German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles beyond their capacity to sustain. The Soviet state, however brutal and dysfunctional, had a capacity to mobilize resources that no other government on earth could match. Entire factories were disassembled and moved east of the Ural Mountains on flat cars, workers sleeping under the machines as they were transported, reassembling production lines in the Siberian winter, getting production running again within weeks of arriving. The T-34 tank was already rolling off production lines faster than the Germans could destroy them. And then the weather changed. The autumn rains of 1941 turned the Russian roads, which were, in most places, simply tracks through the mud, into impassable bogs. The German supply columns stopped. The advance slowed. And then the winter came early and hard, the temperature dropping to levels that the German army, which had not been equipped for winter warfare, could not sustain. Men froze at their posts. Oil and tank engines became too thick to circulate. Weapons misfired. Frostbite casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Before Moscow, in December 1941, the German advance finally stopped. A Soviet counterattack, led by fresh divisions that Sorge's intelligence had established were not needed in the Far East because Japan was going to attack south, not north. pushed the Germans back from the capital. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht had been forced to retreat on a major front. The German myth of invincibility was broken. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on the American naval base in Hawaii was the culmination of a strategic logic that had been developing for years. Japan was a rapidly industrializing power with limited natural resources, surrounded by European colonial possessions rich in the oil and rubber and tin that Japanese industry required. The European powers that held those possessions, Britain, France, the Netherlands, were all weakened or occupied by 1941. The United States was the only power capable of seriously opposing Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The American oil embargo, imposed in response to Japan's invasion of China and later Indochina, was strangling the Japanese military. Japan faced a choice between retreating from its conquests or fighting for access to the resources it needed. Japanese planners chose to fight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, was not optimistic about its ultimate outcome. He had studied in the United States, understood the industrial potential of the American economy, and knew that if the war lasted more than a year, Japan would not be able to match American production. He had argued against the decision to go to war, but once the decision was made, he planned the operation with extraordinary thoroughness. 353 Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. 4 American battleships were sunk, 4 more were damaged. 347 aircraft were destroyed on the ground and in the air. 2,403 Americans were killed, but the American aircraft carriers were at sea on exercises and were not in harbor. They survived, and it was carriers, not battleships, that would determine the naval war in the Pacific. Yamamoto's famous remark after the attack, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve," may be apocryphal, but its substance is accurate. American public opinion, which had been reluctant to enter another European war, was transformed overnight. Congress declared war the following day with a single dissenting vote. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Adolf Hitler, bound by the terms of the tripartite pact with Japan, and apparently convinced that the United States was about to declare war on Germany anyway, declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. This was, arguably, the most consequential and self-destructive decision he made in the entire war. The United States had the largest industrial economy in the world. It had been converting that economy to war production since 1940, under Lend-Lease and under the internal rearmament programs that Roosevelt had been pushing through Congress. Now, it was fully in the war, and the output of American industry, once it shifted to full wartime production, was something the Axis powers simply could not match. American factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, 86,000 tanks, 64,000 landing craft, 5,000 merchant ships built under the Liberty Ship program at a rate, by 1943, of 3 ships per day. 3 ships per day. The industrial capacity of the United States was simply a different order of magnitude from anything Germany or Japan could produce. American women entered the workforce in numbers that permanently changed the structure of the American economy. Rosie the Riveter was a propaganda figure, but she reflected a real transformation. Millions of women who had not previously worked in industry took jobs in factories and shipyards and aircraft plants, and proved, in the most practical and undeniable way possible, that the assumptions about women's industrial capabilities that had previously governed employment practices were simply wrong. The war had become, in the words of Stalin, a war of motors, and America had the motors. In the Pacific, the war turned at Midway in June 1942. The Japanese fleet, attempting to draw out and destroy the American carriers, ran into an American force that had broken the Japanese naval codes and knew exactly where the attack was coming. In 4 minutes of dive bombing on the morning of June 4th, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were fatally hit. 3 sank within hours. Japan lost its offensive capacity in the Pacific in a single morning, and the initiative passed to the United States permanently. The island battles were unlike any other fighting in the war. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island a smaller version of the same pattern. Japanese defenders had been ordered to hold to the last man, and they did, and the Americans had to take each position by direct assault. The casualty rates at Tarawa, at Iwo Jima, were shocking, even by the standards of a war that had already produced shocking casualty rates on the Eastern Front. At Iwo Jima, the fighting went on for 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. The Japanese garrison of 22,000 men was almost entirely annihilated. Only 216 were taken prisoner. In Europe, the tide was turning on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, was the hinge of the European war. Germany's summer offensive of 1942 had driven deep into the Soviet south, aiming for the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad, named for Stalin, a fact that gave the battle a symbolic importance to both sides that went beyond its strategic value, sat on the Volga River, the main artery of Soviet supply to the south. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything that had come before it. Not the open country warfare of the first year of the Eastern Front, where armored formations swept through territory in days. This was building by building, floor by floor, room by room. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, was fighting for individual houses, individual staircases, individual rooms. The Soviets named different parts of the battle for the specific buildings being contested: the grain elevator, the railway station, the Red October factory, the barricades factory. The Soviets held the western bank of the Volga, a strip of city that never grew wider than a few hundred meters at its most precarious. The German attacks were relentless. So were the Soviet reinforcements, ferried across the Volga by night under German fire, fed into the burning city to replace the men who had just died holding the same positions. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. While the Sixth Army was locked in the city, Soviet forces struck the flanks of the German salient, flanks held by weaker Romanian and Italian forces. The flanks collapsed. The Sixth Army was encircled. 300,000 German soldiers were cut off in the snow. Hitler ordered them to hold. Goering promised an airlift that never materialized. Paulus, eventually promoted to field marshal, no German field marshal had ever surrendered, Hitler noted, in what he imagined was an incentive, surrendered anyway. On February 2, 1943, 91,000 surviving German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. The turning point. The moment when everyone who was paying attention understood that Germany was not going to win this war. In North Africa, the Africa Corps had been defeated at El Alamein in October 1942, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery. Rommel's supply lines had finally failed completely. The British had broken the German Enigma cipher and knew where the supply ships were going. Most of them were sunk before they arrived. The Africa Corps fought on short rations and empty fuel tanks, and it showed. By May 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943, and in Italy in September. The Italian campaign was brutal and slow. The terrain of the Italian peninsula, with its mountains and rivers running perpendicular to the Allied advance, provided Germany with a series of natural defensive lines that were each costly to break. The Gothic Line, the Gustav Line, Monte Cassino, where the Benedictine monastery on the hilltop became a symbol of the kind of desperate, grinding combat that the Italian campaign produced, fell only after months of fighting and a controversial decision to bomb the monastery to rubble. Italy itself had surrendered in September 1943, when Mussolini was deposed and the Italian government secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies. But Germany immediately occupied the country and continued the fight. The Italians found themselves suddenly in the strange position of having both Allied and German troops on their soil, fighting each other, with the Italian civilian population caught between them. In the east, the scale of the fighting was beyond anything the Western campaigns could compare with. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans, having lost the strategic initiative after Stalingrad, attempted to regain it with a massive armored assault on a Soviet salient around the city of Kursk. The Soviets had been told by intelligence sources, including the famous spy network known as Lucy, that the attack was coming. They had used the months since Stalingrad to build defenses of extraordinary depth. 8 defensive lines, each one reinforced with mines and anti-tank ditches and artillery positions, designed to absorb the German armored assault and then counterattack into the exhausted German forces. The German attack, Operation Citadel, was delayed several times, partly because Hitler wanted to wait for the new Tiger and Panther tanks to arrive in sufficient numbers. The delays gave the Soviets more time to prepare. When the attack finally came on July 5th, it ran into defenses that were unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered before. The German armor made slow progress at enormous cost. Within a week, it was clear that the offensive was failing. The Soviets launched their counteroffensive. What followed was not the recovery of a beaten army, but the advance of a force that was now, in many respects, superior to what it was facing. Soviet industry had been relocated east of the Ural Mountains in 1941 and 1942. Moved there, factory by factory, under incredible conditions. Entire production lines disassembled and transported by rail across thousands of miles and reassembled in the Urals. The T-34 tank, produced in enormous numbers, was arguably the best tank of the war. The Soviet Air Force, which had been devastated in the first days of Barbarossa, had been rebuilt and was now matching the Luftwaffe. After Kursk, the Germans never launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front again. What remained was a fighting retreat, still bloody, still contested, still producing casualties on a scale that staggers comprehension, but a retreat nonetheless. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies landed in Normandy. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, put 156,000 American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops on 5 beaches on the coast of Normandy in a single day. The planning had taken years. 2 years of preparation, of training, of assembling the men and the equipment and the ships and the aircraft, of solving the extraordinary logistical problems of moving an army across a sea and landing it on a defended coast. The deception operations were as important as the operational planning. Operation Bodyguard, and within it, Operation Fortitude, created a completely fictitious army group, the 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, that the Germans believed was assembled in southeastern England for an attack on Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point. Double agents fed false information to German intelligence. The Germans took it. They committed their strongest forces to defending Pas de Calais, and kept them there even after the Normandy landings began, waiting for what they believed was the real attack. The deception held long enough to be decisive. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach. At Utah and the British and Canadian beaches, the landings went more or less as planned. Utah Beach, despite a navigational error that landed the first wave a mile south of the intended position, turned out to be more lightly defended than expected. The American forces at Utah suffered fewer than 200 casualties, light by any standard for an amphibious assault on a defended shore. At Omaha, it was different. The landing at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, was one of the worst experiences that American soldiers endured in the entire war. The offshore bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German defenses on the bluffs above the beach had largely missed its targets. Heavy cloud had forced the bombers to delay their release point to avoid hitting the landing craft below, and the bombs had fallen far inland. The amphibious tanks designed to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide fire support sank in the rough seas off Omaha, 27 of the 32 in the first wave. The German defenders, dug into reinforced concrete positions on the bluffs, had survived the bombing and were ready. The troops of the 352nd Infantry Division holding Omaha were among the best Germany had in France. The first waves came ashore in chaos. Landing craft dropped their ramps in water too deep to wade. Men with heavy packs stepped off and sank. Machine gun fire swept the beach from end to end. There was almost no cover. The men who made it to the beach pressed against the low seawall or lay flat in the sand and could not move without being shot. Units had lost their officers. The precise coordination of the landing plan had dissolved in the first minutes. What was left was individual soldiers making individual decisions in conditions of almost total confusion and almost total danger. Some stayed where they were and died. Some moved. The ones who moved saved the landing. Small groups, led by sergeants and junior officers, and occasionally by men with no rank at all, began working their way up the draws, the natural gullies and the bluffs that offered the only routes off the beach. They moved under fire. They moved anyway. By mid-morning, men were on top of the bluffs and attacking the German positions from the flank and rear. By afternoon, the position had been secured, at a cost of more than 2,000 American casualties. By the end of D-Day, all 5 beaches had been secured. The Normandy beachhead had been established. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. It was not quick. The bocage country of Normandy, the dense network of hedgerows that divided the landscape into a maze of small fields, each one a potential defensive position, each one offering the defenders cover and concealing the routes of approach, slowed the Allied advance to a grinding pace for weeks. The fighting was close and brutal, measured in fields rather than miles. The fighting around Caen lasted for months, the city changing hands and being fought over until it was largely destroyed. The American breakout at Saint-Lô in late July finally cracked the German lines. Operation Cobra, supported by a massive aerial bombardment, punched a hole through the German defenses, and Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. French forces of the interior, with American support, entered the city. General de Gaulle led the march down the Champs-Élysées. There was gunfire from rooftops, where German snipers and Vichy collaborators had not yet accepted that it was over. There were flowers thrown by the crowds. There were people weeping in the streets, not from grief, but from something so large and so long suppressed that it came out as tears before it could become anything else. The liberation continued. Belgium, the Netherlands partially, Luxembourg. The Allied advance seemed unstoppable. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, the same forest that had been the key to the French defeat in 1940, aimed to split the Allied forces and reach the port of Antwerp, their main supply depot. The attack caught the Americans by surprise and drove a large salient, the Bulge, into the Allied lines. The fighting in the Ardennes in December 1944 took place in the coldest winter in living memory. Men froze in their foxholes. Fuel froze in tanks. The fog and cloud that covered the region for weeks grounded the Allied air forces, removing one of their greatest advantages. German SS units committed atrocities against American prisoners. The Malmedy Massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were shot by soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division, shocked the Allied forces and hardened their determination. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, a key crossroads town in the Belgian Ardennes. The German commander demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The Germans translated it. They understood it. The 101st held Bastogne. When the clouds cleared and the Allied air forces could fly again, the momentum shifted decisively. The German offensive had run out of fuel, another logistics failure in a war full of them. By mid-January, the Bulge had been eliminated and the front had been restored, at a cost of 75,000 American casualties. Germany's last strategic reserve had been expended. There was nothing left to stop the advance. On April 30th, 1945, in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, while Soviet forces fought their way through the streets above him, Adolf Hitler shot himself. The city fell on May 2nd. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, VE Day, Victory in Europe. In the Pacific, the war continued. The island-hopping campaign had brought American forces to within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. From the Mariana Islands, captured in 1944, American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The firebombing campaign that followed, conventional bombs, incendiary weapons dropped on Japanese cities built largely of wood and paper, was devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed more people in a single night than any other bombing raid in history, including the atomic bombings. Somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people died. 16 square miles of the city were burned to ash. And still, Japan would not surrender. The American military's planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, projected casualties of extraordinary magnitude. The Japanese were expected to defend their homeland with the same absolute determination they had shown at every island in the Pacific. The estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would have been incomprehensible. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb was called Little Boy. It was a uranium fission device, the first atomic weapon ever used in warfare. The explosion was equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosives. The blast killed 70 to 80,000 people instantly. The fires and the radiation that followed killed as many again over the following months. A city of 350,000 people was, in a moment, essentially destroyed. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium device, was dropped on Nagasaki. Between 40 and 80,000 people died. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio. It was the first time most of them had ever heard his voice. He told them that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, which was perhaps the most extraordinary understatement in the history of understatement. He told them to endure the unendurable, to bear the unbearable. Japan surrendered. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Japanese officials signed the surrender documents. Representatives of all the Allied powers signed. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. World War II was over. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people dead. The range is wide because counting the dead of the Soviet Union, where the destruction was so complete and the record so disrupted that the actual figure remains uncertain, is itself an act of historical reconstruction rather than precise accounting. 27 million Soviets, by conservative estimates, perhaps more. Chinese civilian deaths, 6 to 20 million, across years of Japanese occupation that included massacres of extraordinary brutality, the most famous being the Nanjing Massacre in 1937, where somewhere between 40 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed in 6 weeks by Japanese forces that had been given permission, explicitly and implicitly, to do what they wished. 6 million Jews murdered in the systematic extermination campaign that the Nazis called the final solution. Not killed in battle or as the collateral damage of military operations. Systematically identified, rounded up, transported across the continent in cattle cars, and murdered in purpose-built extermination facilities. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. The Holocaust, the Hebrew word is Shoah, catastrophe, was not a side effect of the war. It was a deliberate program, planned and executed with bureaucratic precision, carried out by thousands of people following orders, and also by thousands of people who did not require orders, and who participated because they chose to. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, a meeting of senior Nazi officials in a villa by a lake in suburban Berlin, coordinated the logistics of the extermination that was already underway. The minutes of the meeting, discovered after the war, read like the minutes of any administrative planning meeting, discussing transportation schedules and capacity, and the allocation of resources. The subject being discussed was the murder of 11 million people. The language was bureaucratic, euphemistic, procedural. The participants had lunch afterward. The extermination camps were located primarily in occupied Poland, where the largest Jewish populations in Europe lived, and where the geography made secrecy easier and the transport links were adequate. Auschwitz-Birkenau alone is estimated to have killed between 1 and 1.5 million people, primarily Jews, but also Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, Roma, and others whom the Nazi ideology classified as unworthy of life. The camp operated an industrial process of murder. Trains arrived. Selections were made on the platform. Those who could work to the right, those who could not to the left. Children and the elderly went directly to the gas chambers. The others worked until they could not, and then they followed. The crematoria ran day and night. The smoke was visible for miles. The liberation of the camps in the final months of the war produced a shock in the Allied soldiers who entered them that many described as impossible to fully convey. They had known, in a general sense, that the Nazis were mistreating Jewish people and others. The specific reality of the camps, the piles of bodies, the skeletal survivors, the industrial infrastructure of murder, the meticulous records the Germans had kept of what they had done, was beyond what the imagination had prepared them for. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, ordered the systematic documentation of everything in the camps. He anticipated, correctly, that the evidence of what had happened there would be denied, minimized, contested. He wanted the record to be incontrovertible. He ordered German civilians from nearby towns to be brought to the camps to see what had been done in their name. Some wept, some expressed horror, some maintained expressions of incomprehension that may or may not have been genuine. The Holocaust demonstrated that civilization is not a protection, that the institutions of an educated, technically advanced society can be turned to atrocity, that the fact of being civilized is not a permanent condition, but a continuous, conscious, effortful choice. Germany in 1933 was not a primitive or backward country. It was one of the most educated and culturally sophisticated societies in the world, with a world-class university system, a tradition of philosophy and music and literature and science that was among the richest in human history. And within 12 years, it had organized and executed the murder of 6 million people. This is the most important fact about the Second World War, and about the Holocaust specifically. Not that monsters did monstrous things, but that ordinary people, in an ordinary modern society, participated in and enabled and did not stop an unprecedented atrocity. The guards, the train drivers, the bureaucrats who processed the paperwork, the soldiers who carried out the shootings in the forests of the East before the camps were built, the neighbors who reported Jewish families to the authorities, the citizens who bought the confiscated property of deported Jews at discounted prices. Ordinary people, making ordinary choices within the extraordinary circumstances of a totalitarian state at war. The world that emerged from the war was profoundly changed in ways that are still shaping the present. The European empires were fatally weakened. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, had borrowed so heavily to fight the war that it was effectively insolvent by 1945. The United States, through a combination of financial pressure and genuine ideological opposition to colonialism, pushed the British and French and Dutch and Belgians toward decolonization, with a consistency that reflected a post-war world in which European dominance was no longer sustainable. India became independent in 1947, partitioned into two countries, India and Pakistan, in a process that produced one of the largest population movements in history and communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands. The partition was rushed, the borders drawn hastily by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before and had 6 weeks to divide two provinces containing millions of people of mixed religious affiliation. The consequences of that rushed partition are still producing political tension and occasional violence over 75 years later. The process of decolonization that followed over the next 2 decades reshaped the political map of the world. Dozens of new nations emerged from the ruins of empire across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The transition was rarely smooth. Colonial powers that had exploited territories for generations did not leave gracefully or completely. The economic structures they had built for extraction, rather than development, persisted after independence. The borders they had drawn, with rulers on maps in London and Paris and Brussels, cutting across ethnic and linguistic and religious communities with no reference to the people who actually lived there, remained, because the alternative was chaos. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as the two superpowers whose relationship would define international politics for the next 45 years. The wartime alliance between them had always been a marriage of convenience, two fundamentally different systems, temporarily united against a common enemy, with no genuine shared values or interests beyond the defeat of Germany. The alliance began to crack before the war was even over. At Yalta, in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had negotiated the post-war settlement. Who would occupy which territories? What governments would be installed in the liberated countries of Eastern Europe? What the shape of the post-war world would be? The agreements that were made were immediately contested by the Soviet Union, which installed communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, regardless of what had been promised. Churchill, visiting Washington in 1946, gave a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in which he described an iron curtain descending across Europe, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. The phrase stuck: the Cold War, a confrontation that was never directly military between the two superpowers, but that produced a sustained competition across every other domain, had begun. The atomic weapons that had ended the Pacific War gave both sides, once the Soviet Union had developed its own nuclear program, the capacity to destroy the other, and had established a doctrine of deterrence known as mutually assured destruction. The world had acquired, in the final weeks of the Second World War, a technology that guaranteed that any future war between the major powers would be unlike anything that had come before. And the awareness of this guarantee changed the calculations of every subsequent international crisis. The United Nations was established in 1945, its charter signed in San Francisco in June of that year. 51 nations signed. The organization was imperfect from the beginning. The veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council meant that any action that one of them opposed could be blocked, and the two superpowers routinely blocked each other's proposals throughout the Cold War. But the organization existed. It provided a forum. It maintained peacekeeping forces in various conflicts. It provided humanitarian assistance. It was not the world government that its most optimistic proponents had imagined, but it was something which was more than had existed before. The Nuremberg trials, held from November 1945 to October 1946, tried 24 senior Nazi officials before an international military tribunal. 12 were sentenced to death, 7 received prison sentences, 3 were acquitted. The trials established several principles that had not previously existed in international law: that individuals could be held criminally responsible for crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, that following orders was not a defense, that the state could not shield its agents from individual criminal responsibility. These principles were imperfectly applied even at Nuremberg. The Soviet Union, whose own crimes were comparable in scale, if not in systematic intent, to those of the Nazis, sat in judgment on the defendants, and have been imperfectly applied ever since. But the principles exist. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, is the direct institutional descendant of Nuremberg. The concept of genocide, defined by the lawyer Raphael Lemkin and incorporated into international law in the Genocide Convention of 1948, would not exist without the experience of the Holocaust and the moral necessity of naming what had happened. The Marshall Plan, the American program of economic assistance to Western Europe announced in 1947 and implemented from 1948, provided $16 billion, approximately $170 billion in current values, to rebuild the economies of Western European countries devastated by the war. The program was motivated partly by genuine humanitarian concern, and partly by the strategic calculation that impoverished Western European democracies would be vulnerable to communist political movements. The two motivations were not in conflict. The plan worked on both levels. Western Europe recovered its pre-war economic level faster than anyone had predicted, and the communist parties of France and Italy, which had seemed in 1945 to have genuine prospects of electoral success, were contained within manageable opposition roles. The reconstruction of Germany and Japan, the two principal Axis powers, under American occupation, produced outcomes that no one in 1945 had predicted. Both countries, stripped of their military, their territories reduced, their political systems rebuilt under occupation, became within 2 decades the second and third largest economies in the world. Both became stable democracies. Both became reliable American allies. The transformation of Germany from the country that had committed the Holocaust to the country that became one of the founding members of the European Union and the most consistent advocate for European integration is one of the most extraordinary national transformations in modern history. It required decades of deliberate reckoning with what had been done. The Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the working through of the past, was not a comfortable or quick process. It produced political tensions and legal proceedings and public controversies for decades. Germany did not simply decide to be different. It worked at being different, with the specific awareness that the alternative was returning to what it had been. All of this, the United Nations, the Nuremberg Principles, the Marshall Plan, the decolonization, the Cold War, the atomic deterrence, the reconstruction of Germany and Japan, the European integration that grew from the determination of the European nations that had fought 2 world wars within living memory to build institutions that would make a third impossible. All of it flows directly from September 1st, 1939, and the 6 years that followed. You are living in the world that the Second World War made. Every institution of the international order, every principle of international law, every border on every map, every alliance between every country, all of it was shaped by those 6 years, by the specific decisions made under the specific pressures of the most destructive event in human history. There are veterans of the Second World War still alive tonight. Not many. The youngest of them are in their late 90s. They carry inside them the direct memory of things that the rest of us know only from documents and photographs and films, and the accounts written by people who were there. The smell of a battlefield. Not the clean smell of gunpowder that films suggest, but the full and complex smell of a place where people have been fighting and dying. The cordite and the blood, and the particular sweet rotten smell that has no name, but that every combat veteran recognizes immediately. The weight of a rifle held for hours, the muscles in the arm and shoulder burning with it, and then going numb and burning again. The particular quality of silence after an artillery barrage stops, when the ears are ringing and the world is muffled, and the silence itself seems dangerous because it means something is about to happen. The face of someone specific who did not make it home. The specific face. The specific thing that person said the last time they were seen. The particular way the day went afterward, and the way that day is still carried, decades later, in the body that survived it. When the last veterans are gone, that direct memory will be gone too. What will remain is what remains of all history. The artifacts, the documents, the records, the buildings that survived, and the ruins of the ones that did not. The cemeteries, the memorials, the numbers that can never fully convey what they represent. The photographs and the films that show faces of people who were alive at a specific moment, and who look out from those photographs with the same directness that living faces have. The American Military Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer sits on the bluffs above Omaha Beach. 9,388 white marble crosses and stars of David, arranged in perfect rows across a manicured lawn, looking out over the beach where the men they mark came ashore. The graves are sorted by state. The markers give name, rank, unit, state, date of death. They do not give much else. What they were before the war, what they might have become after it, the specific quality of the life that ended on that beach, in that specific way, on that specific morning. The cemetery receives more than 1 million visitors a year. People who come to stand in front of a specific marker because it marks someone they are related to, or because they have read about the battle and want to stand where it happened, or because they come from one of the countries that was liberated and feel a specific obligation to bear witness. They stand in the rows among the markers, and they are quiet in a way that people are quiet in places where the weight of what happened is still in the air. The weight does not dissipate. It may diminish with time as direct memory fades and the events recede further into the past, but it does not disappear. It remains in the places where it was deposited, in the documents that record it, in the landscape that was shaped by it, in the institutions built in response to it. And it remains in the awareness which the 20th century gave to the 21st, and which the 21st is still learning to carry, that civilization is not a guarantee, that the progress of education and technology and material prosperity does not automatically produce better human behavior, that the same capacity for organization and innovation and collective action that builds hospitals and universities and systems of law can be turned by a specific set of political conditions and a specific set of choices by a specific set of people toward mass murder. This awareness is uncomfortable. It does not resolve into reassurance. The lesson of the Second World War is not that everything is going to be fine because we know better now. The lesson is that knowing better is not the same as doing better. That the distance between the knowledge of what can go wrong and the prevention of what can go wrong requires continuous, active, difficult effort by people who are paying attention and are willing to act on what they see. The guns opened before dawn on September 1st, 1939. They fell silent, finally and completely, on September 2nd, 1945. 6 years and 1 day. In that span of time, more people died than in any other 6-year period in human history. The world was remade, and the remaking continues, in the institutions that were built in the war's wake, in the borders that were drawn and redrawn, in the technologies that were developed for destruction and then redirected toward other purposes, in the generation of people across Europe and Asia who grew up in the rubble and built something from it that was not what they had lost, but was something nonetheless. That something is the world you live in. Its imperfections are visible everywhere. The principles established at Nuremberg were violated within a decade in conflicts whose perpetrators never faced any comparable tribunal. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed by governments that were simultaneously violating most of its provisions. The United Nations was paralyzed for decades by Cold War vetoes. The decolonization that freed hundreds of millions of people from European empire also produced conflict and instability that those millions have been living with ever since. None of this cancels the attempt. The attempt matters. The articulation of what ought to be, even in a world that persistently falls short of it, is not nothing. It is the beginning of the standard against which the falling short can be measured, and the falling short can be protested, and the protest can eventually produce change. The war is over. The dark is quiet tonight. The world, imperfect and aspiring, and shaped by everything that came before, continues. Let it continue without you for a few hours. The guns are silent. The world is still here. Sleep well. The island battles that followed, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, were unlike any other fighting in the war. Japanese defenders had been ordered to hold to the last man, and they did. The casualty rates were shocking even by the standards of a war that had already produced shocking casualty rates on the Eastern Front. At Iwo Jima, the fighting went on for 36 days on an island 8 miles long. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. The Japanese garrison of 22,000 men was almost entirely annihilated. Only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died where they had been ordered to fight, in tunnels and bunkers and caves that had been prepared for exactly this defense. The photograph of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi, taken by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal on February 23, 1945, became the most reproduced photograph of the war and one of the most famous images in American history. It shows 6 men raising a flag on a pole improvised from a water pipe, their faces not visible, their bodies straining with the effort of planting it in the volcanic rock. It was taken during the second flag raising of the day. A larger flag had been requested to replace the first, smaller one, which a colonel wanted to keep as a souvenir. The men in the photograph did not know they were being photographed. They were just raising a flag. 3 of the 6 were killed on Iwo Jima in the weeks that followed the photograph. The world remembers, not always clearly, not always correctly. The specific faces behind the numbers fade. The scale of the suffering resists full comprehension. But the record exists. The cemeteries are maintained. The museums are visited. The testimonies of the survivors, recorded before they are gone, are preserved in archives that will outlast the people who gave them. And on quiet nights, the story is told again, in the dark, for whoever needs to hear it. They existed. They did what they did. The world they made, and the world they saved, and the world they could not prevent. All of it is the world you live in tonight. The guns are silent now. Sleep well. Before the guns fell silent, the world had to reckon with what the atomic bomb meant for everything that came after. The decision to use atomic weapons on Japan was made by President Harry Truman, who had been president for less than 4 months when he made it. Roosevelt had died in April 1945. Truman had not even known about the Manhattan Project, the secret program that had employed 130,000 people across the United States and Canada to build the weapon, until after he became president. The Manhattan Project had begun in 1939, after the physicist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt warning that German scientists might be attempting to build an atomic weapon and urging the United States to develop one first. The scientists recruited to the program included many of the most brilliant physicists in the world, a number of them European Jews who had fled Nazi persecution. They worked at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and they built a weapon in 3 years that changed the nature of warfare, of international relations, and of the human future permanently and irrevocably. When the first test bomb detonated at Trinity Site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, Oppenheimer recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The line has become one of the most quoted in the history of science. It captures something true about that moment. The sense of a threshold crossed that could not be uncrossed, of a capability achieved that could not be unachieved, of a world permanently different from the one that had existed before the flash illuminated the New Mexico desert at 5:30 in the morning. The war that followed from a September morning in Danzig Harbor ended with a flash of light over Hiroshima. Between those two moments, the world had been transformed beyond recognition. The transformation continues. The night is very quiet now. The guns are very far away. Let the quiet hold you. Sleep well. The world is still here.